Hello, hello. We are back again for another Wet Ink Wednesday, and I am joined by Jabari Weathers today.
Hi.
Yeah, they are a tabletop game designer, a tabletop games writer, and an illustrator. And we're going to talk about home. We're going to talk about vampires. We're going to talk about mazes that may or may not be full of diminutive monstrous creatures. Welcome to my little show, Jabari.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm
Uh,
excited.
yeah, so I always like to ask people like, okay, so there's like two paths, right? I think there's like the games writing stuff and there's the artist stuff, and maybe they're very closely aligned and it's the same story, but maybe there's like two stages. Like,
Mhm.
which one came first? Like, did you get into writing because you were already illustrating, or did have you always been doing one follow the other? Like, how did you,
Um,
or you
I
always like from childhood you're like, here's my crayon drawing on this half of the page and here's my 7 sentences on this half of the page, turn it in whatever, I don't know, tell me
hmm,
tell me the story.
will do. Also, if I randomly clap, it's because there's this fly haunting me, which I guess is appropriate. Um, so the way that I got into both of those like disciplines, I drew a lot as a kid and like knew that I wanted that to be a significant part of my life um, from a very early age. And by the time that I was in high school, um, actually, like I think like late middle school, I was like, I'm gonna be an animator.
Mm,
And like I like it was to the point where like I don't even think that this forum exists anymore, but there is this like sort of like edgy like animators forum called like Joined Artists. It had a lot of like internal strife, and also I learned a lot about drawing and animation on that platform. The artists there like definitely like pointed me toward like a lot of cool resources and things. And I was like making flash animations in high school, so I was taking it like really
oh
seriously.
yeah, I mean
Um,
that's serious for sure.
are you familiar with Richard Williams?
Richard Williams, that it I don't know, those names aren't that unusual, so maybe I'm cross pollination, but
That's
I don't. He's the is he the I'm sorry, is he the thief and the cobbler guy? Is that who
yeah,
that is?
yeah.
Okay, okay,
hmm
okay. All
So
right, I pulled it out. I pulled it out there. It was in there somewhere.
he wrote this book called The Animator Survival Kit,
Okay.
which is like sort of like just like the animation principle
Mm,
Bible, honestly. It's so applicable to like so many different things. And like I bought this as a high schooler, and like that was like my life textbook at the time.
yeah.
Like that's how serious I was about it. And like I got to Micah, went to art school in 2010 and applied with like a demo reel and a bunch of other like artwork that I had made in high school. Got in, and switched majors. I switched to illustration at the end of my first year or the beginning of my second year. Like I kind of was just like, I don't know if the animation department is like what I want
Yeah.
uh, my trajectory to be, even though a lot of the other students in this department are making amazing things and I think are really driven. Uh, the way that they were being like guided wasn't gelling with me, but the
Yeah.
illustration department was. So, so like,
I, yeah, I could totally see, like, I don't know, there is sort of like there is that battle, right? Because you've got like art, but then you've also got like, but we want you to get hired as an artist.
mhm.
Therefore, like the best way to do animation is to make like these commercials or whatever, like it was it like that kind of thing where they were kind of like,
No, it was
oh,
the
okay,
opposite. I
opposite.
I I wanted to be a little bit more commercial because like I wanted to work on like TV and film, and I was open to like working um in video games, and like I grew up wanting to make video games as well,
Sure.
and I think that sort of transmuted once I got to college for reasons that I'll go into in a second, and that I think that's where the answer to your original question lies. Like, um, yeah, the animation department I think was like pushing a lot of experimental animation,
Mm,
uh, and like I really wanted a space that was going to make me like very commercially viable.
Right. Right.
And
You're
I wasn't getting that there. And then on top of that, I was considering like the possibilities of like burnout in the animation industry and all these different things versus like
sure.
illustration. And
2010. I mean, that's
meanwhile,
like 2010, that's like well after Pixar, and like that's sort of like there's that out there as well. Like as a that is what animation is now, right?
yeah,
Like um and that's sort of like really different than like I've got my pen and brush, and I'm sure does that did that play into it too, or
I mean, like
about medium
I
or
was nostalgic about 2D animation as well, and
yeah,
like it definitely like made me sad to see that things had pulled so far into CGI, but I was also willing to like take that step into that space if I was having if I was had um that scholarly space to like really be pushed in that
yeah,
direction. But I didn't think that I was going to get it at Micah. Um,
yeah.
and when I
So
looked at,
yeah,
sorry,
go ahead, but like how did you move out of that sort of environment into sort of what you ended up doing? Because obviously you're working as an illustrator now and you're
yeah,
writing game stuff. So like how does that I mean, I think you were about to say that, but like what
mm-hmm.
is that?
the I I was really into the work that the illustration department, like the students were making there, and also like what I was hearing about in that space. Like I felt like they were being pushed in a way that felt like what I imagined when I imagined going to art school. Um, and then like it was sort of this like thing where I was like, yeah, I do like drawing pictures and I'd love to get like paid for that for a living. And it's more complicated now, you know, like now that I
Sure.
do it. But like that kernel is still true. Um, and so I switched in my sophomore year to illustration. Um, and really started like doubling down on like what kind of illustrations do I really like? Oh, I like fantasy art. Do I want to do concept art? Learning more about concept art. It's like most people don't see the majority of concept art that comes out. It's not about like completed images. And I did
Yeah.
want to make like completed images for things. And like one space that did have a lot of imagery that I really resonated with was role playing games. So I
Ah,
fell
here they
down,
are.
yeah,
Role-playing
like I fell
games.
down this like rabbit hole that I already was like on the edge of for a long time. Like I had like access to like old D&D manuals and stuff when I was growing up, but like very few people to play it with besides like my cousin. So I was aware of all of these different things, and suddenly I was at art school playing like role playing games and like helping with the role playing in like analog games club, and that eventually pushed me to be like, I should write a tabletop RPG for my thesis and illustrate it. And the illustrations happened, and a lot of ideation for like a fantasy heartbreaker happened.
Okay, okay. Because I was gonna say, did you do the ambitious thing and plan out your 350-page fantasy heartbreaker, or were you like, no, it's going to be 12 pages and like one quarter page illustration every
I
other page, and like it's just going to be one and done, and I'm going to get it done? Or do you have like a a shirt box full of like the abandoned sketches and stuff like that? Like,
it is it's more the latter, and like the sketches aren't the thing. The sketches turned into full pieces. Like I had like resolved art because I needed to do that because I was attending art school and like we had like a senior thesis show.
all right, all right.
But the the writing half is like what I have buried in my closet, where it's just like I have all these notes and like fucking spreadsheets. I don't know. Is it cool if I like
It's fine, it's fine. These videos
yeah.
aren't made for children, so they're fine.
Cool. Like of these like tables for like generating weaponry and stuff.
Yeah.
like
I mean,
and
that's
like oh
I mean, that makes so much sense though, because if you're like it I mean, I have come to realize over the course of my own career that like my first game is way overproduced and it's bigger than it needs to be, and the complicated there's skill roll stuff that we were trying to do, and it doesn't need to be even as complicated as that. And both my writing partner and I came out of like our business partner Brandon, we came out of like really crunchy games, and so like crunchy games, that's how you make a crunchy game, and we're
yeah,
going to make it a less crunchy game, but it still is more crunchy than we make games now, but that's like the first one that you do on yourself. It is almost always the first one you do is like way too ambitious, and but you don't know that. You don't know that when you get started. You have to make one, or you try to make one. I guess I'm lucky that my first one actually did get produced,
Hmm.
because I started, because Kickstarter exists, and I made my own thing, and um, anyway, I don't need to talk about myself, but like it's very common to have a box of like or a big long thing of unfinished ideas or whatever that just it you know but what is so like then what is your first like sort of real credit in the RPG industry then? um like when did you actually succeed in like breaking into that then, if your first thing was a is still unfinished project? You could still finish it someday, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, like, it still haunts me. I'm in this like weird position where like I've written a decent amount for games at this point, and none of the games that I've been working on designing have like seen the light of day. In part because they're competing with my freelance life, like
Mm,
that, and those are pulling from us overlapping well
yeah,
creatively.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but like keeping up that practice and like having the privilege of being able to like show and share with people like the stuff that I was working on personally, um, I think is what led me to being able to work as a writer on a lot of projects that I've been able to do.
yeah.
Um, and that happened in part because of my illustration career, right? Like the first role playing credit that I got was actually as an illustrator on the Dresden Files RPG for Evil Hat,
Okay.
when they were releasing the Paranet papers. Um, and I had done more work here and there on like a lot of different indie things and like other indie publishing. Um, and eventually started working on like a lot of other like weird projects. Like I did the sortie deck for 7C, like second edition. And ended up doing the tarot deck for Bluebeard's Bride. Um, and meanwhile, during all of this, like the people that I was working with, I was like, hey, I also have like interest in like game design stuff, and like I meet up and talk with them at conventions, and they'd be like really generous with these things. And some of them filled me in on like Metatopia, you know,
Mm. I
and I think that's where like the switch sort of flipped, because I put my name forward for like the new designer um, scholarship that they had, um, and was like, hey, here's this game that I'm working on, and like people were really into it, and I got to play test it, and I got to meet a lot of other designers who like I'd
it's
only
kind
like
of
heard about until that point. Like it's
right.
like
That's
you're like playing and ripping apart my game. This is great. um, so I think that's like where that switch sort of like really started to happen, because I got that FaceTime at Metatopia
yeah.
with a lot of other designers and writers.
Do you
Um,
remember what year that was? That
that was 2019.
2019.
It was
Okay, so that's
early. Was it 20? No, it was 2018.
even so,
Yeah,
it's not
it
that
was
long
2018.
ago, you know.
It's a very, yeah, but it's still like 5 years. It's half a
Yeah, yeah.
decade.
It's a while. It's a while.
Yeah,
Certainly long enough to have lots of different experiences, but it's not like, I don't know. Anyway,
it's not a decade ago.
it's not a decade ago. It's not like you've been at this for 25 years already or something like that,
No, no. Um, and so let's see, there was, I think writing on games really became fully locked in during the pandemic. Like a lot of people, unfortunately, weren't
Yeah,
able to work. But I was in this interesting position where like a lot of people who I would want to be hired by were suddenly like, I have all this time on my hands and I can think about the projects that I want to do, and like
right.
you've been on my radar, so like let's make it happen while we're all isolated. Um, and at the same time, like that was when I was getting my first credits in some of the with some of the larger publishers as well. Like I'd done some writing that I'm actually really proud of before that point. And also like that was the point where you know, some mentors and people who like I looked toward were kind of like, hey, like step onto this thing. Like I got to work on Pathfinder during that time, um, on the Mwangi Expanse book, and like did some like world building, like writing for that, and it went over really well. I did some writing on D&D Fifth Edition for Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, and I think that like those two,
Yeah, I mean, you these are all
sorry,
the biggest names, you know, it's
yeah,
like
those
quickly go.
catalyzed
Yeah,
that for me.
that's great.
Um,
That's great. So I I have this
weird
idea,
path.
like I don't know how you're gonna react. It's kind of like I want to go like kind of hyperbolically philosophical here and ask you a question that kind of pulls together some of what you've been talking about
Yeah,
and
please do.
some other stuff. So I told you this a little bit already, but like I was setting up for the interview, and so I was familiarizing myself with like some of your other work, and I went to the 500-year-old vampire page, and we could talk a little bit about that
Sure.
also. But like I had this memory that I had seen a picture of you wearing like some sort of velvet jacket, and maybe I made it up, but then I um went to the page for 500-year-old vampire, and you hinted that you might be some sort of goblin royalty, but you can't confirm or deny. And then you get on the call today, and there's a picture of the Dark Crystal behind you on the poster. You got Kira and Jen back there. So, oh, and well, of course, the labyrinth feeling is just there a little bit in, or maybe more than a little bit in the home thing that you wrote, which we're definitely going to talk about here in a minute. So here's the philosophical question, right? And this totally, I feel, dovetails with what you were saying about like kind of wanting to do like the drawing side of it rather than the animation side of it. Like there's a, and then getting involved in RPGs, there's sort of like a thing that the Henson Company really trades on successfully, I think. And I think also role playing games are this too, where it's like everyone knows this is fake. We all admit that. Like these are like wooden felt creatures, right? They only look
Mhm.
like creatures. They're not real, you know. And also, we're not really in a horrible realm of Ravenloft, right? Fighting some ancient vampire. Like we all know that, right?
Yeah,
And yet, if we pretend that we are, we will have this experience. If you accept that this like felt pile over here with like googly eyes on it is a living, breathing creature that has desires, you know, you can emotionally respond to it. Even if you've seen the behind the scenes footage where they show you the wire face without the silicon on it or whatever, you know, that is moving by radio. You know this, but there's sort of like a accepting the facade, accepting the artifice of these crafts sort of then like opens up this whole bigger world of like, well, if anything is fake and then it's all real, you know, it's like, is there, am I hitting on something that you respond to with that? Because it
totally.
seems like that is kind of a key to working in, especially obviously with puppets and stuff like that. You kind of have to accept that fakeness, but um you accept the fake as real. But is there something like that that flows through into the illustration work that you've done, or I don't know. It just, this is an idea that I have that I'm trying to pull these threads together. So,
I mean, like I hope so. Is
but like
but I
more so than like a movie. You go to the movie and obviously you know it's fake because you're watching a screen. You're not really there, but there's such a push for that, the realism, the photorealism, and stuff like that, as
Mhm.
opposed to like no, it is clearly on strings, but we're gonna accept it as real anyway. You know, there's it's sort of like the act of pretending makes it more powerful, whereas like getting it right and not having the strings on the puppet would make it less real. Yeah, it's like a weird double think. I don't know.
I
It's a theory. It's a theory that
I
I
have to
have.
say
You've inspired me to it, but like,
I I love that and I empathize with like how hard it is to like articulate this, but I love that this is something that you're like picking up on in my work. Like that feels really affirming. Um, sort of the thing that I'm chasing in a lot of the work that I do is like I want to make images, I want to tell stories, I want to like write words that are immersive for people, um and convincing to people, like emotionally uh
Emotionally convincing. That's a
involving,
yeah,
and
yeah.
like that the like photorealism or like making something look real is one way to do it. um and often the one that is most recognized by like large corporate entities that are working in creative mediums, right? But like it's not the only way to go about
The
it.
subsurface light scattering of our current model is unparalleled, you know.
And so like I think like I want to immerse people and be involved in projects that are immersive to people. And I want to make things that like people want to surrender to.
I
I
like
want to
that.
surrender to a lot of the media that I consume.
Yeah,
Um, and that doesn't always lead by looking like our world, uh,
right.
or looking like the same texture as our world. Like I think that like in some ways when we abstract things, um, you accentuate other aspects of what's around you that um, that people, maybe subconsciously pick up on as part of their experience, but don't actively think about. Um, and when we're able to like draw that out, and I think that fantasy and horror do this
Yeah.
uh, really well in thematic senses, like making work that makes space for that is so important to me, and like that's such a driving force of like why this is my profession, and like this is the space that I'm in because like fantasy and like sci-fi and horror, all of these speculative things portrayed in sometimes really like dreamy ways, uh,
Mm.
by artists who are trying to like look at the world um, through their own abstraction and make sense of it, have like given me those tools as well, and like told me like that's okay to do, that's important to do. um, those are the things that like have given me ramps to like understand the chaos that we live in. you
I,
know
yeah, yeah. I almost see it as like I always I know we're gonna go a little bit more into the horror side now because I know you wanted to talk about it and you mentioned it just now, but like it all of these sort of created worlds, right? When it's almost like by not making it real in like sort of a norm, I don't want to say normal, but like an everyday experience, right? Is the horror of something being off, right? There's something off about an otherwise a normal appearing park bench or something like that.
yeah.
What is that off thing, that one thing that's out of place that creates the horror, creates the sense of dislocation or whatever. Um, and I mean that's a commonly done thing or commonly observed phenomenon. But it's almost like the if you leave space for that in whatever you've made in your art or in a writing, it like invites the person to kind of insert the thing that they would find scary or they would find
Yeah.
fantastic or they would find desirable into that space that you've left in the art, and then that draws them out of themselves a little bit into the art. And is that how it works, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's totally how it works. Like hundreds, any storytelling medium, like any kind of fiction, I think is like has layers of that type of conversation. I think that's compounded in game design for sure. And I think that horror as a genre is specifically a genre that on average asks an audience member to participate with it more directly to complete that experience more
Yeah.
than other things do.
Yeah.
um, because it's asking you to look at like things that are off and
Yeah.
challenging people, but also offering like this catharsis when you reach out in that way. Um,
Yeah, I ended up my company and stuff like that. I have a lot of friends who like horror a lot, and then Wet Ink has published several horror things, and people have told me that I've like with Never Going Home, which is probably the game that I've contributed the most to of all the games that Wet Ink has published that are horror. That's the one that I have put the most into of. And so like people are like, oh, you did it, you figured it out, you're like you know what horror is. And I'm like, do I though? I don't know that I do. And so like I'm always curious to hear it from other people and to talk about it, because I'm not sure I've figured it out yet. And so what do you, I mean, obviously, other than the things that we've talked about, what else about like working in that genre really appeals to you? Uh the horror specifically, like of all the speculative ones, why do you is it an accident that you've done Shang-Chi and 500-Year-Old Vampire and now this home game? Is it an accident, or is it like, no, 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 that's what I want, give me more? Did you you painted the pictures of like the like people pulling the teeth out, right, for Shang-Chi, right? Isn't that, didn't you do the
no,
bad
no, no,
dream
no, no.
pictures for
That
Shang-Chi?
was I did do the
You did the colored ones,
I
right?
did the dream cards,
Yeah,
like the
yeah, the
split
dream
dream
cards.
cards. Yeah.
Some of those are
Um,
really creepy, like mouths
oh,
in the back of the eyeballs in the back of the head and stuff like that. We had
I
several
think
artists
that
do
you're
them.
thinking
So
of Sadia Bai's
yeah, I know
did
several
those
people did them,
pieces.
different ones.
But then
So
there are like those like very colorful,
okay, you did the colored
like,
ones, the good
yeah,
dreams, the good dreams.
yeah, the nice dreams.
But it's still for a horror game at the end of the day, so I'm going to count it as a horror game. But
I did write a scenario for
yeah,
Zhang.
you wrote a scenario too. So
And
yeah, I don't know. Talk about horror a little bit, because
yeah,
I feel like not sure I fully understand it yet, but talking to you
who
today
does?
has helped me understand a little bit.
You
Because what you said about the catharsis and stuff and the invitation to participate, I think I my natural state is not to be that involved with my media, but I think people who are really into horror, they like, no, 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 give it to me. I want to see the like
yeah,
guy get ripped apart on screen by the zombies, and I want to like feel that visceralness, and I want to be so emotionally devastated by like the surprise death of this character. And I'm like, why do you want that, so
I
um anyway, go
I
ahead.
almost like want to amend what I said as far as invitation. I think that horror, every storytelling genre and medium is inviting that participation, right? And I think that like you will get more out of something the more fully you engage with it or attentively. Um, but genre wise, horror is way more demanding of that
Mm,
participation, I think, than a lot of other genres are, which do, I think, sit more in the invitational space. And stories that maybe are not primarily of the horror genre, but deal in horrific things, have that same challenge of entry, where they're like sort of the thing that is repulsive about these stories is also the thing that's sort of that tail going like, are you going to get on? Like, you
uh-huh.
should get on. You're not going to get anything out of this if you don't step on to if you don't strap into the roller coaster. Right? And like,
Yeah.
um I think this is like what I think that loops back to why a lot of people have difficulty with horror, really. Um and also why so many people who deal in it willingly are like, yeah, like give this to me, give this to me. Because it is this catharsis, like this cathartic space. Um, there's a lot of different ways that you can see it. Like one is like, oh, I can get through this like traumatic thing and be okay. Like I think that's
Mm.
like one motivation that I see a lot. Um, one big one for me personally is like horror makes me feel like less lonely in a lot of ways, depending on like the angle that it's approached at, because I can look at something and then be like, oh wow, someone thinks the world is fucked up in that particular kind of way too. Like, thank God someone else sees it.
Well, and I think horror is, I think I know a lot of people who like they like to watch horror movies with other people. They don't watch them themselves. They want to watch them together, and so there is
Yes,
sort of like this community created automatically when you do it that way. But
absolutely.
the kinship thing, like that, like the yeah, I don't know. There is, I don't know, like
Yeah, I think that
people
I
have
think
like seeing your own fears or your own like weird desires like represented by some other artist or whatever is like, ah, yes, I don't feel alone because someone else fears slash loves these same weird things.
yes, yes. Um, I think that's so powerful. And so important to like see that. It's like that's something that's made it easier for me to accept myself, right? Like some of the
Hmm.
like darkest or like some things that aren't really dark about me but are weird. When I see like someone else, and I mean like a lot of someone else, like other people are thinking about the same things and grappling with the same things and maybe like yeah, finding fear in that, but also finding like joy and absurdity and like able to like laugh at those parts of themselves
Yeah.
um, or mourn them.
Yeah.
That's really comforting to me. And I think that's such a important space that people really miss in talking about horror. I think that horror is such an empathetic genre, honestly. Like I think that
Mm.
I'm not going to say all good horror, but most good horror that I think of, and all good horror that I can think of personally, has some layer of empathy that I can find running through it strongly. Um, and and yeah, like I don't know. I feel very held by it as a genre in ways that like even other genres that I care deeply about don't always do the same for me. Like I love fantasy. And that might be like the most important genre to me in my creative life. But some of that importance is because like I love all these aesthetics of it, and I also feel like I haven't been invited into it
Mm.
as a marginalized person in a lot of different axes. Whereas horror is a place where like a lot of marginalized voices really get to like shout about their shit, like show the emotional reality and sometimes literal reality of like what people are going through. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, that I mean that makes sense. I mean all of that, right? And the representation, I know that's been sort of like, I don't know, news even at the highest levels of media in the last 5 or 10 years have been like, wow, black people are making horror movies. They're about being, like whatever. I'm being deliberately reductive, but like
Yes. Yeah. No, I understand.
the for comedic effect, but like that has been sort of like, yeah, I mean, even all the way back to the classic beginning of horror movies in some ways with the what's the Night of the Living Dead, right? I mean, that has like
Mm-hmm.
racial themes in it right from the you know I say themes as a again it's sort of like
That
comic
movie
reduction.
is,
It's like it's
yeah.
kind of the text of that film, not necessarily the subtext. Um uh anyway, so yeah, I mean that is yeah, I don't know. Is there when will the like Jordan Peele gets to do like Lord of the Rings, right? Or when's that going to happen, right?
Gonna happen. It's gonna happen. But like,
Or you'll come back to
what
animation and you'll do it.
will? Oh God. I mean, I don't think I have spoons for that now. um, it's really funny if I were working in like some time-based media, I don't think I would do animation for like a job. I think if I were going to make a movie, it would be film. Because it like I
Well,
can just
yeah, I mean, it's harder to put on screen in some ways, but also like it you film for weeks or months, not like work on it for
years.
4 years or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um, but yeah, like I just think that actually I'm curious, like what how do you feel about horror?
I I don't feel like I understand the appeal. Like I understand like what you're everything you said about the like catharsis and the sort of like traveling safely through the experience because you know it's a movie and you're really it's that artifice thing again. Like you're gonna watch a movie and you're gonna be scared and like it's gonna be stressful, but like you're in control of the stress because you could turn it off.
Mhm.
Or and that's like sort of a power fantasy in of itself, being able to like turn off the stimulus. I understand all that like intellectually, but I don't desire to feel those stressful feelings. So then I don't watch those kind of movies, you know? Um,
I think that there's an assumption that it always lands as stressful, right? And that
well,
horror is always stressful.
right. And Pete, you've said it so clearly, like it there all those things, it's just such excitement, right? There's an excitement and a fear and a catharsis and like a joy and like a recognition. Like there's all these very extreme emotions. I tend to I'm I'm a person who tends not to get that worked up about media. I don't desire to be in that place. And
Mhm.
so books that get me overstimulated or whatever, or movies that I expect to have that reaction to me, I'm disinclined to engage. Um, uh, but I understand the appeal for other people, you know, but it is sort of like, um, I don't know. I think that would be sort of the thing. I've been trying. I've got a stack of books over here that I'm like, I'm going to read them. I'm going to catch up on some of the classics of the genre. I don't even know if they're classics of the genre, right? But they're like, I'm pointing over here nebulously to my
Mhm.
bookshelf where I've got this, I've collected several books. They're like, these are horror books. I'm going to engage with the medium. But then there's always, turns out there's always something I'd rather read first, you know? So,
Yeah. I
um,
well, it's funny. It's just always funny like whenever I'm like talking to someone who like horror doesn't inherently click for, I'm like, but like you like fiction, right? And like so many just pieces of fiction just like borrow, I think, some of their most memorable plays from horror, whether it's recognized as in that genre or not.
well, and I will fully accept that. One of the most moving books that I've read recently is a not moving, but like I think it's one of the best books I've read recently. It's and I didn't even read it recently. It's the last couple of years. Again, I'm looking over here at my shelf as if I'm going to see it. It's I know it's not in my on my shelf anymore because I
It's
gave
in
it
your
to my
mind
mom.
shelf.
Um, but the Barbara Hambly's series, which I think it's the Silicon Mage is the name of the whole
Mm-hmm.
series, and maybe the Silicon Mage is the second one. But there's this straight out of Eldritch something thing where there's like these worlds colliding, and so there's this creature that sort of is like a giant anglerfish being in his own universe, but he is united with like his being has somehow been interfaced with this world because all the worlds are breaking down, and so
Mm-hmm.
he builds a new body out of like a crypt, and so his like all these like ribs are like his big anglerfish teeth, and like this wizard is
Oh,
down there in the crypt, and he's like this like everyone else in the village is like run away screaming that there's like a huge monster in the basement, and like the wizard goes down there and he's like, all right, I don't know what you are, what you want, but like, let's have a conversation. And he's like using protection spells and stuff like that. And it's like,
yeah.
oh, I'm sorry, you had to build your body out of all these leftover human corpses. I see that you're actually some like fishman scientist from another universe. Let's have a conversation about
Mm-hmm.
like the realms colliding or whatever. And you know, and like that element is like I said, it's like clearly horrific in those encounters, but then it's sort of defused at the end. But those scenes are they are terrible. Like when the to like imagine that sort of I mean, all of those levels. Like I'm a scientist working on something, and then like my universe collides with some other world, and now I have to like try and will a bunch of corpses into a new to form a new body for myself. Like that, there is some. It's wild. It's wild.
Yeah.
And so, but that was in the middle of like this fantasy book, because the worlds are colliding. It's like a data scientist lady and this wizard, and then this other astrophysicist guy from, but he's really he's a fish man, sort of. He's not, obviously he's from the universe. He's not a fish. He's probably not even really a he. He's just like, that's the, you got to put
Fish
some
being,
pronoun
yeah.
down on the page. Um, anyway, so yeah, those elements show up all the time, and in other genres, and they are effective and memorable, right? Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I think it's, and like I said, I've written the worked on the Never Going Home stuff where it's like all horror all the time, and
Mhm.
so I do work with it, but it doesn't, it's not my home base, I guess, of interest.
But how did you feel working on that? Like, what
Barney's
did you enjoy
flipping
it?
the interview. Well, I mean, I think, I mean, I've talked about this in other places, but for me, it's the it's a metaphor. The horror of World War One for me is a metaphor for the indescribable experience of being put in that incredibly stressful situation. And so like it is, I don't feel, as a non-military person, non-veteran type, I've not had to experience that. And but I have read about like Cthulhu monsters. So like if
Mhm.
I transpose it's almost by like adding, for me personally, it's almost like by adding some eldritch sort of stuff and dark magic and other stuff that I'm familiar with through fantasy into a World War One setting, then you get to begin to understand as a complete outsider what an
The total
experience of,
shock.
yeah, like this is
Yeah.
something I don't understand. I don't know what this is, and but putting that in the trenches makes the sort of that experience of the First World War, and not know like all the other things, the mud and the mustard gas and all that kind of stuff. It sort of metaphorically transfers between things I can sort of understand in a fiction sense into beginning to understand a reality. Um, and that's how I have worked it, for me, in that one particular game anyway. So um, I don't
Interesting. I'm just like, uh, I feel this like objective popping in my brain of like, how can I make horror make sense?
know. No,
Which I'm
I don't know. This is a whole journey that I've been on, Jabari. You don't have to solve, you don't have to fix me today.
I know, but I
You know,
love engaging with it a little bit. I think
sure.
the last thing I'd want to sort of say or like ask there is like, like how do you feel about comedy?
I know the two genres are aligned. I'm not a huge fan of being made to laugh either. Maybe I'm just like a person who, like, people love like The Office. People love that show, and I'm like, I mean, yeah, it's I can understand that it is funny, but I'm just sort of like, I don't need to laugh. I'm just a very boring person. I like to keep myself on an even keel. I don't know what that's about.
I don't,
Well,
I
I
don't,
mean, I can take some guesses, but
I don't think you seem like a boring person. That's a very fascinating thing to say. But yeah, I was just you've headed me off of the past there. I was gonna be like, yeah, like they operate on similar.
they're very similar things, I think. Or the I love, I don't know if you know Craig Campbell. I like him a whole lot, but he's got a game, a horror comedy game where you're like, the whole thing is you're making a bad horror movie and you're gonna die, and when your time comes up you're supposed to be splatterfest in the most hilarious way possible.
Mhm.
And I'm just like, I buying this game to support you, Craig, but I have no interest in playing this. This is like two things I don't like that you've put together. Um, you know, uh, but he's working on a new one now that's like Space Disaster. It uses the same rules, but Space Disaster. And I'm like, ooh, Space Disaster, great. Let me get sucked out of an airlock. But like, as long as I don't have to make it funny, it's fine. So I don't know. That's maybe I will finally figure it out someday, learn to appreciate it. But I think I need to engage with it more than I have to really, which is why, again, I've got the books. I have like 12 books over here on my list that I'm going to read someday. I promise I'll read them someday.
Are you surrendering to them though?
Ooh, see, I think when you said that earlier, that was pretty powerful. And you used language like that when you were talking about horror. So I think that is sort of the thing. I'm a person who likes to be in control, and so like
Mm,
surrendering may not be a natural state for me. So uh and I know I'm mindful of our time. We've talked a little bit here. So I do want to give you at least a little bit of opportunity to kind of maybe like at this point, because we've gone on so long, maybe at least we could talk about home a little bit, and like maybe the way that you've talked about horror and what appeals to you. How did you put that into the very limited amount of writing that you got to do for home? Because it's the card prompts. There's what are there's 13 cards in this
mhm.
little packet, that is expanding on the haunted house game, and so it's not a lot of words, right? So like what did you do with this, for the home game? And we can finish up talking about like that a little bit.
I mean, I guarantee you that one aspect of what I did is like I looked for things that would scare me, but
Mm.
also stuff that like made me laugh.
Well, so possibly just because I recently read Hieronymus by Laurie O'Connell, which is
Mhm.
it's like a hex crawl through the Garden of Earthly, all the Bosch
Yeah.
paintings, the Hieronymus Bosch paintings. So one of your cards is like you walk into a room and there's like two people who are playing a third person as an instrument, and the person is screaming in pain. And like then it says like, and how do they play you? And how do you scream out? It's like, so it is sort of like surrealist and comedy, but also like it's horrible, right? To be like made to feel pain while being played by as an instrument.
Mhm.
Uh,
I
so
mean,
I
you
don't know
see
if
me
you,
like cracking up here,
yeah,
right?
you're laughing.
And yet like it you're right, like that's horrific. That's a horrific exercise to imagine. Um,
But you can't help laughing at it.
no, and I can't help laughing about the idea of a bunch of people sitting around a table trying to describe that, right?
So the joke is, so it's operating on a meta level where like you're like typing it out and like I'm gonna make people describe this to each other when they play this game,
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, like I think but like that's a moment that so much tabletop role playing in particular. I think it's a little different from LARP because you're so fully embodied, but like
Mm,
tabletop role playing, you have the separation from your physical body. So you can describe these very impossible things which aren't in your space, but are in like the shared um imagined space,
yeah,
right? Like much more accessibly because it's all bio words. Like that's the reality that we've all bought into.
right.
Um, like what you were talking about
Yeah,
earlier.
yeah.
Um, and so like I love finding bizarre prompts to activate that space, right? Like that's where I felt the most magic in tabletop games. And I was looking to provoke that with these kind of weird prompts, like what would it feel like to be played like an instrument? And also like that kind of question, as absurd as the narrative reality of that is, like I do think that like that collection of words has some kind of a emotional resonance because like the notion of being played like an instrument, like that's a turn of phrase that we all have, and I think
Mm,
that people
yeah,
have by means of this idiom being used have felt that way. And so in some ways it's not so inaccessible, because the question is kind of prompting like how does it feel to be like used or had.
yeah, yeah. Well,
um,
it is sort of like a game of like the what if the metaphor was real, but then by making it real, it's still the metaphor. Like it plays on the multiple levels at once.
yeah.
Uh, yeah. Is there anything else you would want to say about the particular haunting tale that you did? I
I
referenced earlier
mean,
that it's like it makes the haunted house into like, you basically stumble into like a party, like an unexpected ghostly sort of party is happening. So all these like, rather than being alone in the house, you're encountering a lot of people in the house,
yeah. Um,
or people, beings of some sort, images,
home
something.
home as a game like has some like fascinating mechanical tech going for it, right? And like the way that it conveys geography was
Mm.
really exciting for me. Um, and that was a very immediate guide as to like the kind of things that I was wanting to do with it. It's like, oh, we're creating a space together. Like, how do I linguistically make people lost? Like that's a North Star immediately. We're talking about spaces. Like, how do I make spaces feel wrong? um, it seeing
Without
them,
using the, just it's easy to call them non-Euclidean, but like, what does that mean?
yeah, right.
Or
Like it's
and not like a definitional term, but like what makes them wrong?
mhm. um, and it's not my job to answer that question, right? But like I sort of had to in order to ask hopefully questions that I think were good.
Yeah.
Uh, the other thing that like that I try to do whenever I'm doing like horror writing in general is like and I've talked about this. I can send a link if you want to hear more at length about it. But like
Oh,
there's
we'll,
this
we'll get
there's
to
this
links in just a
notion
minute.
there's this notion that I've talked about before of immersive implication.
Ooh.
And it's this method of or it's this thing where like the media that you are participating in like calls you in and like makes you have to like really sit with your agency and sit with um like the choices that you're making. I think that we take our agency for granted. And it's weird, like in horror games, there's a lot of the way that we are spending our actual agency in the meta is in describing how our avatars are having their agency taken away. And it speaks a lot to like
Mm.
what we're thinking about in terms of like how we see control in our lives and like what makes us feel free
Yeah.
and how we show up to um support that for like our community and like the people around us and ourselves. So I think there are shades of that as well. um Especially like there's and it's been a little bit so I'd have to look back at like specifically what I wrote, but like I was feeling that so sharply um, in some of the like archetype questions I was asked to write. Like there
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
hold on.
So you
Mm,
have the back of the card, the back of the indulgent archetype. You got answer these questions. So who have you dragged even deeper into indulgence than yourself? Is the last of the three questions that you
mm,
answer. And then your two needs, your need as the indulgent is either to quell the temptation through radical indulgence or to be cared for, particularly through being denied. Um, so those the ones you were
yeah,
remembering?
yeah. And I like there's all of those different aspects are like those were really vulnerable questions that I felt like I was calling myself out
Mm,
about. Like they made me squirm, and some of that is because it was like, ooh, there's an aspect of like choices that I am making um, that have collateral damage, sucking someone else deeper into something, have aspects of like not knowing where your boundaries are or should be, and discovering them. And I think like those things that can scale and be really extreme for a player, they can be like very small and relatable for a lot of people. But in both cases, like there is this choice that the player has to make that feels a little bit personal. even if it's not something that that person actually struggles with, like there's still like a mental exercise there
Yeah,
that I found really compelling
there's
and
so
kind of
much, that if you've got a choice of archetypes, you're likely to pick one that is you more than others. But even if you try to pick one that's opposite of you, then you'll still kind of play it from
yep.
what you know, right? Because it's always you. You're always playing you in some respects, or absence of your, or opposite of yourself or something, which turns, whatever. It's the negative space is still the outline.
Mhm.
Um uh, anyway, I think we're close to the end of the time that we have today. Jabari, we could clearly continue talking for a while, but
I'd
I
love
want
to.
to get out of before we leave. I want to make sure you mention links. So if there's any links that you would like people watching this video to follow to find out more about you, to some of your other writing. I mentioned 500-Year-Old Vampire in passing, but I didn't actually, we didn't actually end up talking about it, which is totally fine. But like, what where can people find your work? Where are you on the internet?
You can find me, uh, you can find my illustration work and soon some of samples of my writing work, probably in 2024, um, at goblinprincette.com, Princete, and then Goblin, just straightforward.
Yeah.
Um, and you can also find me on Twitter. That's primarily where like games writing stuff, uh, that's the most accessible place to talk to me about games writing stuff. It's the same handle, Goblin Princette. Um, and I also have an Instagram for illustration things that is under the same handle. Um, yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Well, great. I will put those links in the description of this video. We've kind of had to get to the end quickly, but thank you so much for chatting with me today. I think it's been an interesting conversation. I think you have it's you've got a clear understanding of what you're doing with horror, and thank you for sharing that. And you've inspired me to maybe not hold on so tightly to my even keel sometime. So,
But thank you for like being curious and this interview. This has been a wonderful time. I'd be excited to hear where that takes you if you surrender yourself to the genre a little bit more.
well, everybody will keep posted, I guess. Once again, thank you for your time, and thank you everyone who watched this conversation.
Thanks.